Good morning, fight fans. Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports podcast for another episode, an episode that I never thought I would record, an episode that I never thought I would dive into in terms of this being a serious event that will be taking place on Triller Fight Club Saturday night. Jake Paul, YouTube sensation, if you want to call him that, Jake Paul, takes on former Bellator MMA champion and former ONE Championship champion Ben Askren, former UFC fighter as well. Before I dive into the fight and who I think will win and give my preview and prediction for the fight, I want to remind you guys to subscribe to the Thomas Take Sports podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And feel free to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Those 5-star, 4-star, all the stars. Give me all the stars, whether it's 4 or 5. I believe it's 5. Give me a 5-star review. Leave a nice, review description. I would greatly appreciate it. Those reviews matter. Those reviews count on the Apple Podcasts, quote unquote, algorithm as well. Tuning in on Facebook and YouTube on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook and YouTube page. You can follow along with all my tweets on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. As well, subscribe on YouTube and like the Facebook page. The show is everywhere. The show's doing very, very well. We're 2 weeks away, less than 2 weeks away from the 2021, NFL draft. And I'm in the midst of, putting together a mock draft that I think will have a lot of people agreeing with me. I think I'm going to be hitting on a lot of these first-round picks once again, whereas last year I did as well. So I think this is going to be another solid, quote unquote, mock draft from yours truly in terms of that first round, and putting together a Buffalo Bills mock draft is something that I'm going to do as well. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. And you will enjoy it. So this is the Jake Paul versus Ben Askren preview and prediction show. This is a fight that has taken on a life of its own. This is a fight that gained a lot of notoriety in terms of the underground scene, whether it's hardcore MMA fans, hardcore boxing fans, or casual MMA fans or casual boxing fans. And I think that's what makes this fight very different, is that the casual fans of both sports, whether it was MMA or boxing, were able to rally around this fight and make it a reality. And Snoop Dogg's got his own, production company, promotion, where we saw Iron Mike Tyson make a return to the boxing ring against Roy Jones Jr. A few months back, and it was a successful event. A part of what made that event so successful was not only the return of Iron Mike Tyson, but this YouTuber, this former Disney Channel star, Jake Paul, that people are so fascinated with. It's a part of that new age, cringy reality TV YouTube spin that we are starting to see with today's generation. And I'm talking like the teeny bopper generation, as far as YouTube fans, TikTok fans, TikTok followers, all that stuff. That's what has really made Jake Paul this quote unquote sensation, if you want to call him that. I think, my personal opinion, I think that this fight is one of the more egregious fights to ever happen in combat sports. I didn't anticipate this fight actually becoming a reality, and the fact that it has, I think that it is a sign, really, that we can only expect more of these events. The first one that was this quote-unquote crossover event was McGregor and Mayweather. Not a lot of people thought that fight would become a reality. It did, and then some. It's one of the highest purchased pay-per-views in the history of the pay-per-view business. So we knew that was just the first domino to fall, the first drop in the bucket. We knew that we would only see similar fights to Mayweather-McGregor in the future. So to answer my own question, are these quote-unquote crossover fights the future of combat sports? I wouldn't even say that they're the future of combat sports. I would say that they are here, and they are here to stay. I don't see those types of fights essentially going anywhere, because you have this Jake Paul Ben Askren fight. Ben Askren has openly admitted that he's making more money for this fight against Jake Paul than he ever did in his mixed martial arts career. If that doesn't tell you something about the harsh reality of the pay structure, the pay scale that MMA fighters face each and every fight, I don't know what will. This is probably the easiest paycheck that Ben Askren will ever get in his life, in terms of being paid more to do something that if he fails, he could always raise his hand and say, hey, this isn't something that I have trained in the last, 10 years. Not necessarily an excuse. That's just a simple fact. Ben Askren is not a boxer. He's a MMA fighter, predominantly a wrestler. If this doesn't work out for him, will it be embarrassing? 100%. But can he always lean on the fact that he's not a boxer? I'm sure he will, and I'm sure that there are people that will say, oh, that's ridiculous, that he'll lean on that. Well, I wouldn't be shocked if that did happen. And then in terms of Jake Paul, he's finally getting the opportunity that he's been asking for, taking on a fighter that is a true fighter, that has that experience competitively, stepping into an octagon, stepping into a boxing ring, where Jake Paul can finally test himself and say, hey, I am good enough to go into a ring or to go into any arena with a fighter of this caliber. Ben Askren, people can say whatever they want about the fighting career of Ben Askren. And I want to address the fight career of Ben Askren because I've followed him practically his entire career. Ben Askren has always been somebody to me that is one of the few fighters that made probably one of the smoothest transitions from freestyle wrestling, NCAA wrestling, to mixed martial arts. One of the best transitional stars of amateur wrestling to professional mixed martial arts. And we all look at Ben Askren now and we say, well, he was a part of the fastest knockout loss in UFC history. Jorge Masvidal, he puts his hands behind his back. He's against the cage. He runs up, does that flying knee, lands flush on the chin of Ben Askren as he's diving down on a double leg, on a single leg. And that's what Ben Askren's legacy is to more fans than not, unfortunately. More fans remember Ben Askren for that loss to Jorge Masvidal than they do for the actuality of Ben Askren's career. The hardcore fight fans remember and know what Ben Askren's fight career actually was, is, and always will be. And to me, I always look at those underlying points. What's a point within Ben Askren's career that you can honestly make? And I think it's a point that most people would agree with, and that is Ben Askren's time in the UFC was too little too late. It was far too late. The window of opportunity for Ben Askren to move on from Bellator to the UFC kind of came and went. And the era in which he was a prime fighter, the Nick Diaz, the Carlos Condit, the George St. Pierre era, with those guys lumped in, Ben Askren was not a part of the UFC at that time, and there was no doubt about it that Dana White didn't want him to be a part of the UFC at that time due to Ben Askren's quote-unquote lay and pray, dive for the legs type style that Dana White has never enjoyed as a promoter. So better late than never, I guess. Ben Askren comes aboard to the UFC and takes on a guy by the name of Robbie Lawler, who has always been one of the more devastating strikers in UFC history. That's his first fight, former UFC welterweight champion Robbie Lawler. That's Ben Askren's first fight in the UFC. It doesn't exactly go well. There were some bumps and bruises along the way, but Ben Askren gets the win. It was a controversial win, but he gets the win. Next up, you have Till versus Masvidal, and Ben Askren, I think at that time, assumed that Darren Till was going to win that fight. Darren Till gets knocked out by Jorge Masvidal in vicious fashion. Ben Askren looks at Jorge Masvidal and says, well, this guy is not known to defend many takedowns. This guy has double-digit losses on his professional mixed martial arts record. I am undefeated. I haven't lost a fight ever in my pro MMA career. I just got to do what I usually do. Set my trap, shoot that takedown, initiate the clinch early, and make this a wrestling dominant fight. Unfortunately, it didn't work that way. So I think in recency bias or recency takes, we look at Ben Askren's career and we say, well, he didn't really achieve what he was supposed to. I don't think that that's true. I think that anyone would have been knocked out flush by that knee that Jorge Masvidal threw in that fight. A running knee, flying knee, where he had momentum only moving forward, charged forward through the leg, up through the knee to the chin. out Ben Askren went. But what I found fascinating about Ben Askren's fight career is that despite losing in 5 seconds to Jorge Masvidal, despite being humiliated on that replay, as we've seen it, I've seen it probably 50, 60 times, his stock actually went up in the process of losing the way that he did. His stock didn't actually go down. His stock actually went up. Because he faced the music, he did the interviews, he talked about the loss, and now he's taking on a fighter that people wanted to see him fight. And I'm not even going to call Jake Paul a fighter because he's not, but he's participating in a fight contest with someone who everyone wanted to see him fight. So I look at Ben Askren as a highly respectable, MMA fighter, despite the fact that he's responsible for being on the receiving end of the quickest knockout ever. He was undefeated. He did fight Andrei Koreshkov, a really good striker in the sport of mixed martial arts. Fought Douglas Lima, who has been one of the better Bellator fighters in the history of their company. Did beat Robbie Lawler. I don't think we can really look at Ben Askren's career fulfilling his full potential as a eventual UFC champion, but I think it was possible in his prime that Ben Askren could have went from Bellator to the UFC and pulled off a similar run to what Michael Chandler is pulling off right now. Michael Chandler is getting an immediate title shot off of one victory to Dan Hooker, whereas Ben Askren, had he had a dominant Ben Askren-like victory against, let's just say, a Carlos Condit or even a Nick Diaz, you better believe it, he would have been next in line to take on George St. Pierre when GSP was the champ, or even in the Hendricks, Lawler era of the UFC welterweight division, we could have seen Ben Askren make his impact and let his presence be known at that time in the UFC. But we move on and we say, well, hey, Ben Askren had some hip injuries, had some hip problems. He decided enough was enough. He retired from professional mixed martial arts, and he's looking at this fight, and he's looking at Jake Paul as a boxer, and he's saying to himself, this guy's taking on two tomato cans, a former NBA slam dunk champion, and a guy that I never even heard of. Ben Askren's been a competitor. Ben Askren's been a fighter his entire life, practically. Competitor his entire life in wrestling, a fighter in his later competitive career. Knows what it takes to feel the pressure, knows what it takes to put himself in that mental headspace of getting in there, whereas Jake Paul has only put himself in that mental headspace as a boxer against very, very mediocre competition. So what fascinates me about this fight is you have a wannabe boxer taking on someone who was a fighter in another form of combat sports and was successful in only one form really of combat sports as a combat sports athlete. Ben Askren was not known as a striker in the sense that he, knocked anyone out or pieced anybody up, threw a beautiful jab, threw a beautiful straight, knew how to slip a punch and fire off an uppercut. Ben Askren's boxing within his mixed martial arts game was always looked at as not only some of the worst in mixed martial arts, but somewhat non-existent. So for Ben Askren to take this challenge, it says to me, he's willing to maybe be embarrassed, and not in his eyes, but in the eyes of, the folks that'll be watching this fight, to take 12 weeks, dedicate 12 weeks to a boxing training camp with the hope that that is good enough to beat Jake Paul. I think that's a valid thought. I have not been impressed with Jake Paul's boxing. I've only noticed that Jake Paul's competition has been two guys that look like they've never even fought before. Ben Askren's fought before. He does know how to move his head. He does know how to slip punches to set up a takedown. But in this boxing match, Ben Askren will not be able to clinch in the variety of ways that he was able to as a mixed martial arts athlete. Clinching in the boxing realm, clinching in a boxing fight, you're only allowed to clinch for a very limited time before the referee decides to pull you guys apart. You're only allowed to clinch when you're against the ropes or if you're hurt, and even then the ref pulls it apart. So Ben Askren can't set up punches in ways that he could in MMA. He would set up those punches in mixed martial arts via the clinch. He can't do that this time around in a full-out boxing match. Not necessarily in the same way. So we will see these guys be forced to stand toe-to-toe and trade punches. And Ben Askren's given up a reach advantage. Ben Askren's given up a size advantage. Will that matter? And Jake Paul, as a boxer, I've watched his training sessions. I've watched his drills. The guy hits the bag pretty well. The guy hits the mitts pretty well. But in the words of the greatest of all time in mixed martial arts, George St. Pierre, everyone is a champion hitting the mitts. Everyone's a champ hitting the mitts. Nobody is an amateur hitting the mitts. Everybody looks good hitting the mitts. If I'm Ben Askren, I'm feeling pretty confident going into this fight. And if I'm a betting man, which I'm not, but sometimes depends on the event. If I'm a betting man, who will win? I'm picking Ben Askren. I don't think Ben Askren can lose this fight. He shouldn't. He's dedicated his life to combat sports. Even though he was not known as a boxer in his mixed martial arts career, he has had to drill striking over the course of his career. So will he be able to throw those punches as a boxer the way he did as an MMA fighter? I think he will, because I think Jake Paul's boxing is just that non-existent. And to take this as a serious challenge, if you're Ben Askren, as a competitor, you have to take each and every challenge seriously. But how can you take each and every challenge as seriously as you want when you have this opponent standing across from you, an opponent that has had a non-existent combat sports career? It's a very tough sell for me if I'm Ben Askren to convince myself that I'm in any danger heading into this fight. So I think Ben Askren is going to get the win. As far as the round, what round could this fight end? I think it could end probably in the 4th or 5th round. If Ben Askren implements that pressure, if Ben Askren sticks and moves, Ben Askren tries to be a little bit fast in there. It's going to be very tough for him to do that because he's not the fastest guy, but footwork, I think, will be key for Ben Askren in this fight as Jake Paul tries to impose his own size advantage on Ben Askren. Ben's going to have to learn how to move, slip and slide, stick and move, and I think he'll do that. It's crazy that this crossover fight is something that the fans somewhat asked for. As it started to gain a little bit of momentum, Jake Paul asked for Ben Askren in his next fight as his next opponent. He got Ben Askren as his next fight, as his next opponent. And fight fans are left feeling like they're the winners out of this. The question is this fight good for boxing? The question is, what does this fight say about the state of boxing currently? And I'll start off by answering the first question. Is this fight good for boxing? In all honesty, this fight is great for boxing in the sense that boxing has needed a new drove of a fan base throughout the last 15, 20 years. And this fight will bring eyeballs to boxing. This fight will bring eyeballs to the other fighters that will be on this card. And this fight will generate attention. I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't a fight that was sensible to talk about. And then in terms of my next question is, I asked, is this fight good for boxing? Is this a fight that we could take seriously, I guess you could say? We'll find out. Will this be a fight that we can look back on and say, yeah, that was a good fight. That was a fight that, held its place within combat sports. We'll see. We'll see. Is this fight good for boxing? I think it is. But will this fight be a great fight? entertainment-wise, will be entertained, but will the boxing in and of itself be solid boxing? I can't say that it will be with a straight face. I can't. Just can't. So there you have it. I got Ben Askren winning this one. I think it's going to be a 4th or 5th round knockout or TKO. These crossover fights in the co-main event of this card, we got Richie Cunningham versus is it Richie? Something Cunningham. Cunningham versus Frank Mir. Cunningham, a former champ. Frank Mir, obviously former UFC champ. So there are crossover fights. It was Steve Cunningham. I said Richie Cunningham. Steve Cunningham. These crossover fights are here to stay. And whether people are happy about that, dismayed about that, indifferent about that, I'm here to tell you, with my eyes as closely on mixed martial arts and boxing as they always have been, these crossover fights started with Mayweather-McGregor, and they're only going to continue. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Looks like Oscar De La Hoya is making a comeback into the boxing ring. Rumor has it that former UFC champion Eddie Alvarez, former UFC champion Tyron Woodley are two opponents that Oscar De La Hoya wants to fight in the boxing ring. So further proof that these quote-unquote crossover fights are here to stay. Thank you so much for tuning in. The Thomas Take Sports Podcast, as I said, is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care and stay safe.